the medicine that could have changed history. How religious hatred killed Oliver Cromwell. What if I told you that one of the most dramatic turning points in British history came down to a single decision about medicine? Not a battle, not an assassination, not a political betrayal, but a dying man's refusal to swallow a powder because of who discovered it. Oliver Cromwell, the man who had executed a king and ruled 3 nations with an iron fist, lay dying in September 1658. His physicians knew of a treatment that could save him. The cure was available, probably within a day's ride of his deathbed. And yet, according to multiple historical accounts, Cromwell refused to take it. Why? Because it was called Jesuit's powder. Today, we're going to explore something that most history lessons skip entirely: the intersection of medicine, religion, and power in 17th century England. We'll examine how a mosquito bite in an Irish marsh set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately restore the British monarchy. And we'll confront an uncomfortable truth about human nature, that our prejudices can become so deeply embedded that we'd rather die than accept help from those we consider enemies. But this isn't just a story about Cromwell. It's a story about all of us, about the choices we make when our beliefs collide with our survival, and about how a single decision can reshape the course of nations. The disease that never leaves. To understand Cromwell's death, we first need to understand the enemy that had been living inside him for nearly a decade. In 1649, Cromwell marched his army through the marshlands of southern Ireland. He was there to crush Catholic resistance, and within weeks he would oversee the massacres at Drogheda and Wexford. That would forever stain his legacy. But Ireland extracted a price that no one anticipated. The marshes were thick with mosquitoes, and sometime that October, one of them bit Oliver Cromwell. The fever struck him shortly after, leaving him, in his own words, very sick and crazy in my health. His physicians called it tertian fever. We call it malaria. Now, here's what most people don't understand about malaria, and what Cromwell certainly didn't grasp. Once those parasites enter your bloodstream, they never truly leave. They burrow into your liver. They hide. They multiply. And then, when your immune system is compromised by stress, by grief, by exhaustion, they emerge and wage war on your body from within. The malaria parasites that entered Cromwell's bloodstream in 1649 would spend the next 9 years slowly destroying him. Each fever attack meant billions of parasites bursting simultaneously from his red blood cells, triggering his immune system into overdrive. Each recovery left him slightly weaker. Each bout took longer to survive. By 1658, Cromwell had endured multiple near-death experiences from this disease. In 1651, while campaigning in Scotland, the fever was so severe that Parliament dispatched their best physicians from London on a journey that took over a week. Cromwell himself wrote that he thought I should have died of this fit of sickness, describing an illness so violent that indeed my nature was not able to bear the weight thereof. He survived that time, but survival isn't the same as recovery. The visible decline of power. Foreign diplomats are often the most reliable observers of political figures because they have no stake in flattery. They report what they see because their governments need accurate intelligence. So when the Venetian ambassador wrote in cipher to his masters in 1654, his observations carry particular weight. He noted that the Lord Protector looked pulled in appearance with signs that his health is not stable and perfect. But then he added a detail that seems small, yet reveals everything. When Cromwell removed his hat in greeting, the hand holding his hat trembled. Consider what this means. This was Oliver Cromwell, the man who had charged into cannon fire at Marston Moor, who had signed King Charles's death warrant without his hand shaking, who had toppled a monarchy and rebuilt England in his own image. Now, at 54, he couldn't hold a hat steady. The tremor was just one symptom of recurring fevers that struck without warning. Sometimes he'd be fine for months, conducting state business, meeting with his council, reviewing troops. Then the disease would return. First came the shivering, even in summer, even beside a roaring fire. Then the fever would spike until his clothes were drenched with sweat. The cycle would repeat, cold, hot, cold, hot, each phase lasting hours. His physicians called these episodes agues and considered them a natural hazard of English life. What they didn't understand was the microscopic war being waged inside their patient's body. The synchronized waves of parasites destroying his blood cells, the progressive damage to his spleen and liver. Meanwhile, Cromwell ruled England with increasing paranoia. He wore armor under his clothes, changed his travel routes at the last minute, slept in different rooms each night. Historians often attribute this to fear of assassination, and given that royalists were actively plotting to kill him, that fear was justified. But there's another explanation that deserves consideration. Chronic malaria affects the brain. It causes anxiety, paranoia, mood swings. The disease that was slowly killing Cromwell's body may also have been reshaping his mind. The breaking point. In June 1658, as London sweltered in an unusually hot summer, Cromwell received news that would shatter him more completely than any military defeat. His daughter Elizabeth was dying. Elizabeth Claypole wasn't just any daughter. At 30, she was Cromwell's favorite child, and everyone at court knew it. While his other children embraced their father's stern Puritanism, Elizabeth had something different about her. She was known for intervening on behalf of imprisoned royalists, using her influence to secure pardons and reduce sentences. In many ways, she served as her father's conscience. By late July, Elizabeth lay in Hampton Court Palace, her body ravaged by what physicians suspected was cancer. Her youngest son, Oliver, had died just weeks earlier. Imagine being Cromwell in that moment, the most powerful man in 3 kingdoms, able to command armies and bend parliaments to his will, yet utterly helpless to ease his daughter's suffering. Contemporary accounts describe Cromwell spending hours at her bedside, praying, weeping openly. This was almost unthinkable behavior for a man of his position in that era. Servants reported hearing him bargaining with God, offering his own life in exchange for hers. On August 6th, Elizabeth died. Her body was taken by barge down the Thames to Westminster Abbey, and Cromwell followed on horseback. Witnesses said he seemed to age 10 years in that single day. What happened next was medically predictable, but politically catastrophic. Grief suppresses the immune system. Stress compromises the body's defenses. The malaria parasites that had been lurking in Cromwell's liver, waiting for their opportunity, found it. The final siege. Less than 3 weeks after burying Elizabeth, Cromwell's final battle began. This enemy couldn't be defeated with cavalry charges or artillery bombardments. It attacked from within, and it gave no quarter. The pattern was familiar but devastating. 5 distinct fever attacks struck him between late July and September 3rd, each worse than the last. Between attacks, he would seem to recover, even conducting state business from his bed. These false recoveries were cruel, giving hope to his supporters, while allowing his enemies to wonder if he might somehow survive. The attacks themselves were horrifying to witness. First came shivering so violent that the bed frame shook. His teeth chattered uncontrollably. Servants piled blankets on him, stoked fires higher, but nothing could warm him. Then, as suddenly as it began, the cold phase would end and the fever would spike. Without thermometers, his physicians couldn't measure his temperature, but they noted his skin was burning to the touch. The sweating was profuse, soaking through his nightshirt, the sheets, even the mattress. Servants had to change his bedding multiple times a night. Then came the vomiting and diarrhea, so severe he could keep nothing down, not even water. His throat became raw from constant retching. A persistent cough developed, bringing up bloody sputum. But the worst part was the pain. Cromwell, who had suffered battle wounds without complaint, who had led charges into enemy lines, cried out in agony. He described feeling like his backed stomach were being torn apart from inside. Modern medical analysis suggests this was likely his spleen swelling massively as it tried to filter the enormous numbers of damaged red blood cells, pressing against other organs. The cure that sat untouched. And here we arrive at the darkest irony of Cromwell's death, the tragedy that transforms this from a story of disease into a story about human nature itself. By 1658, European medicine had discovered something remarkable. Jesuit missionaries in Peru had learned from indigenous peoples about a bark that could cure malarial fevers. They brought it back to Europe and distributed it widely. The medicine worked. It had saved countless lives across Catholic Europe. We now call the active ingredient quinine. It specifically targets malaria parasites in the bloodstream. A few doses could break the fever cycle and save a dying patient. This wasn't folk medicine or superstition. It was genuine pharmacology, even if no one yet understood why it worked. Cromwell's physicians knew about Jesuits' powder. They could have obtained it. England had trade connections, and medicine crossed religious boundaries regularly. The treatment that could save the Lord Protector's life was probably available within a day's ride of Whitehall Palace. But according to multiple historical sources, Cromwell refused to take it. The word Jesuit was enough. This was the man who had slaughtered Irish Catholics at Drogheda and Wexford, who had banned Catholic worship in England, who saw the Pope as literally the Antichrist. To accept medicine discovered by Jesuits, distributed by Jesuits, named after Jesuits, it would mean accepting help from his most hated enemies. Think about the calculation happening in Cromwell's fevered mind. You're dying. You know you're dying. Your body is failing. Your daughter is dead. Your republic is fragile. A cure exists, but taking it would mean acknowledging that your enemies had something valuable to offer, that the people you've spent your life fighting might have knowledge worth accepting. What do you choose? Now, some historians argue this refusal never happened, that it's a myth created by later writers to make Cromwell look foolish. They point out that contemporary medical records don't definitively confirm he was offered the medicine. But what we know for certain is that he didn't receive it, whether because he refused or because his Protestant physicians wouldn't prescribe popish powder. Oliver Cromwell died of a disease that had become treatable. The prayers of a dying man. By September 2nd, everyone close to Cromwell knew the end was near. His valet, Charles Harvey, stayed by his bedside, recording his master's final words and prayers. These records give us an intimate window into Cromwell's last hours, and they reveal something unexpected about the man who had terrorized his enemies for so long. The night before he died, Harvey offered him something to drink. Cromwell's response was haunting. "It is not my design to drink or to sleep, but my design is to make what haste I can to be gone." He was ready to die. But even as his body failed, his mind remained clear enough to wrestle with how history would remember him. 3 days before the end, witnesses recorded a remarkable prayer. "Lord, though I am a miserable and wretched creature, I am in covenant with thee through grace, and I will come to thee for thy people. Thou hast made me, though very unworthy, a mean instrument to do them some good." Then came the line that surprises everyone who thinks of Cromwell as a tyrant without conscience. "And many of them have set too high a value upon me, though others wish and would be glad of my death." He knew that half of England wanted him dead, that they celebrated his suffering, that they saw him as a usurper and murderer. And here's what truly stands out. He prayed for those enemies. "Pardon such as desire to trample upon the dust of a poor worm, for they are thy people too." The man who had shown no mercy at Drogheda, who had signed Charles I's death warrant without hesitation, spent his last coherent hours praying for the people who hated him. Whether this represents genuine spiritual transformation or simply the fear of a dying man, we cannot know. But it complicates the simple narrative of Cromwell as monster. The Day of Providence. September 3rd held massive significance in Cromwell's mind. It was his Day of Providence, the anniversary of his greatest military victories at Dunbar in 1650 and Worcester in 1651. He had often said that God had marked this date for him, that it demonstrated divine favor for his cause. Now it would mark his end. The final attack began on September the 2nd and accelerated through the night. By morning, Cromwell could barely speak. Witnesses describe him mumbling about God's will, about England's future, but the words were increasingly incoherent. The fever had finally reached his brain. At approximately 3 in the afternoon on September 3rd, 1658, Oliver Cromwell died. He was 59 years old. He had ruled England for nearly 5 years, commanded armies for over 15, and changed the course of British history forever. Outside Whitehall Palace, a massive storm was raging. Winds that witnesses called unprecedented for September tore through London, toppling trees, ripping roofs off houses. Royalists claimed it was the devil himself come to collect Cromwell's soul. His supporters said it was God mourning the loss of his faithful servant. More likely, it was coincidence, a September gale that happened to arrive at a dramatic moment. But the storm would become inseparable from the legend, proof that even nature itself seemed to mark Cromwell's passing as extraordinary. What the autopsy revealed? The very next morning, physicians arrived to examine Cromwell's corpse. Dr. George Bate, his personal physician, the same man some historians suspect was a secret royalist, performed the autopsy. What they found inside was both revealing and disturbing. The brain, Bate recorded, had overheated. The vessels were overcharged. In modern terms, this suggests severe inflammation and possibly cerebral edema. The lungs were engorged with fluid, explaining the coughing and difficulty breathing in his final days. But the spleen told the real story. While normal in size, it was filled with matter that looked like the lees of oil, that thick black sludge that settles at the bottom of oil containers. This description has fascinated medical historians for centuries. Modern physicians recognize it as potentially indicating severe sepsis or the aftermath of repeated malarial attacks. The spleen, which filters damaged blood cells, had essentially become a repository of cellular debris from years of disease. The autopsy was, by Bates' own later admission, badly carried out. The physicians were looking for poison. Rumors were already spreading that Cromwell had been murdered. They found disease instead. The funeral, that wasn't. What happened next reveals just how badly things went wrong. After the autopsy came the embalming, and this is where the situation became grotesque. The embalmers wrapped Cromwell's corpse in 6 layers of waxed cerecloth, placed it in a lead shell, then enclosed it in a wooden coffin packed with sweet herbs. Within days, it became clear that something had gone catastrophically wrong with the preservation process. Multiple sources confirm that the body swelled and burst. The putrefaction was so severe that the stench became unbearable, even through multiple layers of wrapping and the sealed lead shell. Consider what this means. The most powerful man in Britain, whose state funeral was being planned as one of the most elaborate in English history, was rotting so badly that he had to be secretly buried to hide the smell. Between September 10th and September 23rd, Cromwell's actual corpse was quietly interred in Westminster Abbey. No ceremony, no public witnesses, just a quick burial to contain the stench. But the state funeral couldn't be cancelled. Too much had been invested politically and financially. The solution was audacious in its deception. They would hold the funeral anyway, just without the body. Thomas Simon, the renowned medalist, had taken a death mask of Cromwell's face shortly after he died. Working quickly, he had to disguise the saw marks where the skull had been opened during autopsy. He used pads beneath the eyelids to make the sunken eyes appear more lifelike. From this mask, craftsmen created an elaborate effigy, a wooden body with a wax face, dressed in purple robes of state. From September 20th to November 10th, this dummy lay in state at Somerset House. Thousands of people filed past, paying their respects, never knowing they were viewing an elaborate fake. The effigy was so convincing that foreign ambassadors reported back to their governments about viewing Cromwell's body. They described his peaceful expression, his dignified repose. They were describing wax and wood. The actual funeral procession on November 23rd was one of the most elaborate in English history, taking 5 hours to travel just over a mile through London. The empty coffin, remember, the real body was already buried, was accompanied by the effigy, thousands of mourners, and representatives from every level of government. John Evelyn, the royalist diarist who attended, wrote with bitter sarcasm, "It was the joyfulest funeral that ever I saw, for there was none that cried but dogs, which the soldiers hooted away with a barbarous noise, drinking and taking tobacco in the streets as they went." The revenge of the monarchy. Cromwell's body lay in Westminster Abbey for less than 3 years. When Charles II, son of the King Cromwell had helped execute, was restored to the throne in 1660, Parliament demanded vengeance. They couldn't kill Cromwell, but they could defile his corpse. On January 26, 1661, parliamentary agents came to Westminster Abbey with a specific mission: exhume the bodies of the leading regicides. They chose the date deliberately. It was the 12th anniversary of Charles I's execution. It took considerable effort to remove Cromwell's body from its vault. The wooden coffin and cerecloth had partially fused together in decomposition. The corpse, along with those of his son-in-law, Henry Ireton and John Bradshaw, was taken to the Red Lion Inn in Holborn. There, in a grotesque display, the body spent the night under guard while crowds gathered outside, eager for tomorrow's spectacle. On January 30th, the 3 decomposed corpses in open coffins were dragged on a sledge through London streets to Tyburn, where common criminals were hanged. The crowds were enormous. This was revenge as public theatre. At Tyburn, the bodies were hanged from the triple tree gallows and left suspended from morning until 4 in the afternoon. When they were finally cut down, the executioner began the grisly work of decapitation. Cromwell's corpse, 3 years dead and partially mummified, required 8 blows to sever the head from the body. The headless remains were thrown into a pit beneath the gallows, the common burial ground for executed criminals. But the heads received special treatment. They were impaled on 20-foot oak poles and raised above Westminster Hall, where they would remain for decades as a warning to any who might challenge the crown. The 3-century journey of a head. Cromwell's head stayed on that pike above Westminster Hall for more than 25 years, slowly mummifying in London air, becoming a grotesque landmark. Sometime around 1685, a great storm finally blew it down. A guard allegedly found it, recognized what it was, and hid it in his chimney. What followed was a bizarre 3-century odyssey that might be the strangest post-mortem journey in history. The head passed through the hands of various collectors and showmen. In the 18th century, it was displayed in a museum of curiosities. By the 19th century, it was being exhibited for money. Pay 6pence to see the head of the tyrant Cromwell. Scientists examined it. Historians debated whether it was authentic. It was sold and resold, authenticated and re-authenticated. The head became a curiosity, a collector's item, a morbid attraction. Finally, in 1960, exactly 300 years after the monarchy was restored, Cromwell's head was buried at Sidney Sussex College, Cambridge, his old college. The exact location remains secret to prevent vandalism. After 3 centuries, Oliver Cromwell's head finally found peace. The medical verdict. Modern physicians studying the historical records have reached a consensus about what killed Cromwell. The primary cause was almost certainly malaria, specifically a severe form called malignant tertian malaria, possibly complicated by typhoid fever or other secondary infections. The evidence fits together like a medical puzzle. The cyclical fevers over many years match the pattern of recurring malaria. The enlarged, debris-filled spleen found at autopsy is characteristic of chronic malarial infection. The vulnerability following emotional stress from his daughter's death aligns with what we know about how grief suppresses immune function. The malaria parasite he picked up in Ireland in 1649 had been waging war in his bloodstream for 9 years. By 1658, his body simply couldn't fight anymore. What makes this medically fascinating is that Cromwell's case demonstrates how malaria operates as a chronic disease. It doesn't always kill quickly. Instead, it weakens the host over years, hiding in the liver between attacks, gradually destroying the body's ability to recover. Each fever cycle damages more red blood cells, strains the organs further, leaves the victim more vulnerable to opportunistic infections. Cromwell's death wasn't just about disease. It was a perfect storm. The emotional devastation of Elizabeth's death weakened his psychological defenses. The stress of maintaining power in an unstable political situation compromised his immune system, and the refusal or inability to access quinine treatment sealed his fate. The mosquito that changed history. Here's what makes Cromwell's death historically significant, and why I think this story deserves far more attention than it typically receives. If Cromwell had taken the Jesuits' powder, if he had lived even 5 more years, English history might have unfolded completely differently. His son Richard might have had time to establish himself as a capable ruler. The Commonwealth might have stabilized. The monarchy might never have been restored, or at least not restored so quickly and completely. But disease doesn't care about politics or power. The malaria parasites multiplying in Cromwell's bloodstream didn't know they were killing the Lord Protector. They were following their biological imperative: reproduce, spread, survive. In killing Cromwell, they killed the Commonwealth. The restoration of the monarchy in 1660 was in many ways made possible by a mosquito bite in an Irish marsh in 1649. This is history at its most contingent. The recognition that massive political transformations can hinge on microscopic events. A single insect, carrying a single parasite, changed the trajectory of a nation. The lesson of the refused medicine. But I think there's something even more important in this story than the role of disease in history. It's the question of the refused medicine, the cure that existed but wasn't taken. Whether Cromwell personally refused the Jesuits' powder or his physicians wouldn't prescribe it, the outcome was the same. A treatable disease killed England's ruler because the treatment was associated with the wrong people. This isn't just a 17th century problem. We see versions of this dynamic constantly in modern life. People refusing vaccines because of distrust of institutions. Patients rejecting treatments because of where they originated. Nations failing to cooperate on global challenges because of historical grievances. Cromwell's death asks us an uncomfortable question. What are we willing to die for? Not in the heroic sense of dying for a cause, but in the stubborn sense of dying rather than accepting help from those we've defined as enemies. The Jesuits' powder worked regardless of who discovered it. The quinine would have attacked the malaria parasites in Cromwell's bloodstream without asking about his religious beliefs. Medicine doesn't care about politics, but humans do, and sometimes that caring kills us. The humanity in the monster. I want to end by returning to those deathbed prayers, because I think they complicate any simple understanding of Oliver Cromwell. This was a man responsible for genuine atrocities, a man whose name still evokes horror in Ireland centuries later. The massacres at Drogheda and Wexford were acts of deliberate terror against civilian populations. His rule in England was authoritarian, his treatment of dissenters often brutal. And yet, in his final hours, he prayed for his enemies. He acknowledged that many wished him dead. He described himself as a poor worm and asked God to pardon those who wanted to trample upon his dust. Was this genuine spiritual transformation? The fear of divine judgment? Delirium from fever? We cannot know. But it reminds us that historical figures are human beings, not cardboard villains or heroes. Cromwell was capable of both massacre and mercy, of both tyranny and tenderness toward his dying daughter. He could sign a king's death warrant without his hand trembling, and then spend his final coherent hours in prayer for those who hated him. This complexity doesn't excuse his crimes, but it should make us cautious about reducing any historical figure to a simple label. The same Cromwell who slaughtered Irish Catholics couldn't bring himself to take their medicine, even to save his own life. That's not just stubbornness. It's a kind of terrible consistency, a refusal to compromise on identity, even at the cost of survival. The storm and the silence. Outside Whitehall Palace, as Cromwell breathed his last, the storm raged. Trees fell, roofs were torn from buildings. People would remember that storm for generations, would argue about what it meant. Inside the palace, the room eventually fell silent. The fever had broken for the last time. The parasites had won their 9-year war. And within 2 years, the monarchy would be restored. Cromwell's corpse would be dragged through London streets, and his head would begin its 3-century journey from Pike to Museum to secret grave. The man who executed a king was executed himself 3 years after death. The Lord Protector, who had conquered kingdoms, couldn't conquer the parasites in his own blood. And the medicine that might have saved him, the Jesuits' powder, stands as a monument to how prejudice and hatred can literally kill us. Cromwell died as he had lived, uncompromising to the end, even when compromise might have saved his life. Perhaps that's the most important lesson of his horrific final days. Our beliefs can give us strength, can drive us to achievements that seem impossible, can sustain us through trials that would break others. But those same beliefs, held too rigidly, can become the very thing that destroys us. In the end, Oliver Cromwell was killed not just by malaria, but by his own certainty, his absolute conviction that accepting help from Catholics would be worse than death. He made his choice, and 3 nations lived with the consequences for centuries. Thanks for watching. If you found value in this video, please hit the like button. It really helps the channel. And if you want to see more, check out this video right here. See you in the next one.